Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see all of you here today, and welcome to anyone who's joining us for the first time. My name is Christina Kepi. I am the director of the Center for Canadian American Studies here at Western Washington University. I would like to start with land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that Western Washington University's main campus is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples, who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin all throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. We express our deepest respect and gratitude to our Indigenous neighbors for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. So we're really excited to have you all here today. Today's presentation marks the second of this year's annual speaker series. The speaker series is titled Populations Rendered Surplus in Canada. We'd like to also thank our co-sponsors and partners for helping make today a success. And they are the Foundation for Western and Alumni, the Ray Wolpo Institute, and the World Issues Forum of Fairhaven College of Interdisciplinary Studies. Our speaker today is a practitioner and student, Christopher DesRivieres. Christopher graduated from La Cite Collegial in 2008 as an architectural technologist. He received his BA in Canadian Studies with an emphasis on Indigenous Studies and a minor in Anthropology from Carleton University in 2020. Then went on to complete an MA in Canadian Studies with a specialization in Heritage and Conservation from Carleton University in the spring of 2023. Throughout his undergraduate studies, he was able to blend his professional career and knowledge with his passion for Indigenous studies and issues. And now he's currently working for general contractors as an estimator in the nation's capital, Ottawa. And today he will be speaking on reconciling our built heritage, the decolonization of 100 Wellington. It's going to be a very, very interesting talk. I would also like to welcome the students joining us today from James Miller's Indigenous Placemaking class. This is one of our Canadian American Studies classes. Welcome all. Should any students have questions for Christopher during the presentation or during the Q&A, feel free to put them in the chat, but identify yourself as a student so that we can address those first and foremost. We like to be able to acknowledge our students as much as possible. So just a moment of housekeeping before I pass it along to our honored guest today. Some of you who have already submitted questions with your registration. You can continue to submit questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom middle of your screen. We'll get to as many of those questions as we can. Hopefully we'll have about 15 minutes for a Q&A at the end of Christopher's presentation. So we recommend that you use the speaker view as part of Zoom to best get a full view of the slides. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Christopher DesRivieres. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone. Oh, sorry, I am going to share my screen first. There we go. Perfect. So I'd like to thank everyone, and particularly Christina, for inviting me to speak on Indigenous placemaking. And for those who took the time to be here today to listen to my presentation on the Indigenous Peoples Space. So before I begin, I'd like to also acknowledge that where I am from, the nation's capital, Ottawa, located in Canada, is on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabeg Nation. And so Hayden King, who is a Anishinaabe academic and the executive director of the Yellowhead Institute, has stated that land acknowledgements are nothing more or are nothing without action. And so I take this time and I want to emphasize that we as students, academics, professionals, and citizens have the privilege and the duty to make our societies better places for Indigenous peoples. It is my wish that with my research and my presentation that at least one more person will become aware of the ongoing struggles of settler colonialism and that impact that it has on Indigenous peoples from day to day. I'd also like to thank, or at least as a settler, I feel privileged to speak on my knowledge and navigate these conversations in spaces carefully and with intent. And so as mentioned, I am a graduate from Cite Collegial, took architectural technology and worked in the industry 17 years, mostly for general contractors in the National Capital Region. And so with this career, I was able to learn my city more intimately, got to know some technical details about old buildings and new buildings, and also hearing the discourses behind like why and how these buildings might need to stay or be removed. After a while, I decided to challenge myself and needed a little bit of change, and got my bachelor's from the Carleton University. Though it wasn't Canadian studies, I emphasized on strictly Indigenous studies courses, and also a niche for anthropology to give me that anthropological lens when I look at ideas like gift giving, which is very prominent in my research. And so my studies form pretty well with the multidisciplinary aspect of Canadian studies at Carleton in particular. And within that department, there are a lot of engineers and architectural professionals who do have specialization in heritage. And through that program, I was able to streamline myself into their master's program and specialize in heritage and conservation. So at one point in my career, I felt at crossroads where I felt I might need to pivot completely from a contracting background with my technical degree, but I was able to kind of blend both now, at least with my research and hopefully professionally as well. So without further ado, I will begin my presentation. So the Indigenous Peoples Space is located at 100 Wellington, Ottawa, Canada. And it was the former United States Embassy, which has been vacant for the past few decades. The space and site are quite particular as it sits on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabeg. However, in 2017, for the 150th anniversary of Canada's Confederation, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau gifted this building to the National Representative Organizations, also known as the NROs, which consist of the Assembly of First Nations, the Inuit Tapyatit Kanatami, and the Métis National Council. So what began as a seemingly innocent and well-intentioned gesture in the heart of reconciliatory efforts, the inheritance of this building has now become an active case study that simultaneously addresses colonial architecture with Indigenous design intentions from various cultural groups across Canada. I cannot find any specific information regarding what the Algonquin or Anishinaabe would have held for this particular area, but what can be said is that Indigenous presence has been here since time immemorial, and recent archaeological findings due to the center block rehabilitation project across the street shows that the Algonquin and Anishinaabe have been here for at least the past 4,000 years, which is what you see here in this picture. If we extend the parameters of what makes this particular space or place Indigenous, we just need to look about a kilometer outside of this area and look at Ottawa as a general place. And it holds a very particular meaning to the Algonquin and Anishinaabe, but also Indigenous peoples from all around. As you can see from the image on the right, Ottawa is at the crux of three particular rivers. You have the Kichizibi, the Ottawa River, and then the Gatineau River from the north. And these, in this particular geographic area, has been a center point for Indigenous peoples to gather and trade and to celebrate for hundreds and thousands of years. And so a particular landmark that is very special to the Algonquin and Anishinaabe, which I can't go into too much detail for sake of time, is the Victoria Island, which, I mean, is technically kind of right here. But despite numerous requests to have this space for them, they have met a lot of roadblocks in particular. And so when the announcement for 100 Wellington came into place and they were excluded, there was a lot of political tensions within those groups. So in addition to this the federal government initially excluded the Algonquin and Anishinaabe from this process. So it was immediately called out by the Algonquins of Pikwakanagan and the Anishinaabeg of Kitigan-Zibi, a community in north of the city in the province of Quebec. So in response to this unthoughtful gift that excluded the consent in the involvement of the home community, despite ongoing several decades-long battles with the federal court regarding a land settlement for the land on which this building resides, the Algonquin and the Anishinaabe spent several weeks and months over several years protesting this inconsiderate gift. The protest caused long-term delays in the development of this site, as the Algonquin and Anishinaabe wanted to be considered as equal partners. However, there was some political infighting between various Indigenous groups. Partly, the Inuit Taputut Kanatami did not want to give up a part of their pie for this building. Seeing as there were three major Indigenous groups, the spaces were divided into threes. And so the response was to have the Assembly of First Nations give out space allocated to them to the Algonquin and Anishinaabe. However, the Algonquin and Anishinaabe wanted to have a quarter of the space, seeing as it was their home community, and that they shouldn't have to sacrifice any more space that has already been stolen from it in the first place. Moving on. So I want to point out that for those familiar with any work from Glenn Coulthard, this falls in line with the politics of recognition. So where the government fails to hear or listen to the demands of Algonquins as its own separate sovereign nation, it only decides to choose to negotiate and deal with Indigenous organizations that they've essentially helped and create and to help fund. Briefly, I'd like to discuss my methodology. I want to stipulate, due to my line of work as a professional working in construction, and particularly that works in buildings adjacent to my research subject, I had to pivot and change my research approach midway. So I initially intended to do interviews and to get more context from Indigenous voices, predominantly from the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation. However, due to considerable conflict of interest that I foresaw, I refrained from exposing myself and others to potential backlash. I instead focused on analyzing any current data that was available and providing a critical analysis of the material in hopes that providing this as an initial stepping stone for any future academic or Indigenous organizations or organizing bodies interested in this particular building or this case study with heritage buildings with Indigenous occupation. My methodological framework integrates aspects of grounded theory as it provides an interpretive and qualitative approach to inquiry that privileges Indigenous voices. Grounded theory is also a qualitative research method that has flexible guidelines for data collection and data analysis, commitments to remain close to the world being studied, and the development of integrated theoretical concepts grounded in data that show process, which was very important to me, relationship as well, and social world connectedness. Grounded theory offers the possibility of being decolonized by integrating Indigenous epistemologies or methodologies, as it is based in critical, open-ended inquiry. So I grounded myself in Indigenous research methodologies, focusing predominantly on Sean Wilson's and Margaret Kovac's work. This shaped my research approach as more fluid and less rigidly structured. I also incorporated practices of visiting, which Kovac wrote a lot about, which consisted of embracing the process of visiting with someone or something. In this particular case, I would spend time, whether it was my commute in the morning, a lunch break, or my commute back in the evening, walking by this building and spending time with it at different times of day, different times of season. Unfortunately, this was interrupted by an occupation that took place here, if anyone paid attention. But in the February of 2022, the Freedom Convoy protesting vaccine mandates for international truckers occupied our city for about 3 weeks, but had rippling effects because the entire year afterwards, the entire space in front of my research subject essentially was occupied with a bunch of far-right protesters. And so I had to adapt and deal with the time that I had, but that practice at the time served very purposeful, particularly that due to the nature of this building, which we'll get into more details later, I wasn't able to spend any time on the inside due to being closed to the public. In addition, I concentrate mostly on Algonquin and Anishinaabe voices, particularly authors that come from the Ottawa watershed, such as Lynn Gale, Leanne Patamasaki Simpson, and Julie Tomiak. As mentioned, I incorporated critical discourse analysis, which involved analyzing various government documents, academic articles, newspapers, and any other printed media that I was able to find on forums that discussed any of the political negotiations. So as mentioned, the Indigenous Peoples Space is the former embassy to the United States of America. It was constructed in 1932. According to the Federal Heritage Buildings Review Office, FEBRO for short, this building is essential to our national heritage. It is the building, the first building to house the U.S. legation in Canada, which coincided with Canada's transition to a sovereign state, no longer dependent on the Crown in 1931. In addition to these intangible heritage values associated with this building, FEBRO has recognized several architectural features that form the tangible heritage elements designated to the now Indigenous Peoples Space. The architect for this building is Cass Gilbert. This building is considered to be one of the best representations of Beaux-Arts style structures in Canada. And so I will quote from FEBRO on their website. So the former U.S. Embassy is a very good example of United States government architecture of the early 1930s. It features a simple rectilinear form, classically designed elevations of pale Indiana limestone wrapped around the principal symmetrical entrance and side elevations, a flat roof, and a setback penthouse. Externally and internally, design employs a simple palette of high-quality materials expressing the importance and prestige appropriate to a United States Chancery Embassy. The building is valued for its excellent aesthetics, qualities, and its excellent functional design. So the details for which it is designated are less critical, but only to note that because the building envelope is what makes it designated as heritage, it creates a lot of red tape for what the Indigenous people space can become. So in addition to these architectural elements that make it physically a designated building, there are also environmental reasons. And as you can see in this picture on this side here, this is the front gate, which is called the Queen's Gate, which faces our Parliament. And so what FEBRO says about this is occupying a prominent site opposite the Queen's Gate to Parliament Hill, the former U.S. Embassy respects and harmoniously reinforces the highly visible Wellington Street edge of the hill and is a distinguished landmark feature of the parliamentary precinct. So this building alone no longer is, this building alone cannot be seen as alone because it forms part of a broader cultural landscape, essentially is what these two elements say. So given its proximity to the Parliament of Canada, this building has defining architectural elements that determine its status as historical place and space under the protection of the Historic Sites and Monument Act from Parks Canada. During its vacancy over the past few decades, this building has cost on average $200,000 to taxpayers for maintenance a year, whether it was to heat or to restore rusting items or elements of the building that have been falling apart. A architectural historian named Charles M. Davis describes Beaux-Arts style architecture as a style that embodies colonialism. It appropriates autochthonous art into its design and is framed with Western European colonial architectural elements. In particular, Beaux-Arts-style architecture is known for its adornments, which typically feature signs of scenes and local and national importance, such as nature and its indigenous peoples. Appropriating them for the benefit of a national monument, placing it as something valued domestically, but representative in form internationally with those other states that support Westernized architecture. So here in this picture, we can see, which is now the inauguration of the Indigenous Peoples Space. So the context behind creating the Indigenous Peoples Space is directly associated with our current government's efforts towards reconciliation. On Indigenous Peoples Day, June 21st, 2017, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced that the former U.S. Embassy would be gifted to the NROs. According to the Prime Minister's official website, it is stated that this location symbolizes a turning point in Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples. It provides a concrete marker in the heart of the nation's capital and facing Parliament Hill of the importance of Indigenous peoples to its country, foundation, to its past, and most importantly, to its future. End quote. So on Indigenous Peoples Day 2017, it is arguably the moment this historic place has been forever transformed, at least conceptually. So this day marks a turning point in Canadian history towards moving forward with reconciliation through various symbolic gestures, one of which on the same day, our Prime Minister had renamed a government building from its previous, from a name that was associated with someone who committed colonial atrocities on Indigenous peoples. And so that was a symbolic gesture. And within the same time too, we will see how those gestures are easier to do than it is to try to remove the colonial aspects of this building. In response, the Assembly of First Nations has quoted, the Indigenous Peoples Space will serve as a concrete and symbolic centerpiece for Indigenous peoples and their governments to meet with other governments, institutions, citizens, and visitors. It will provide space where Indigenous governments, organizations, and institutions gather to either conduct intergovernmental functions and host events of a diplomatic nature, or educate Canadians and visitors about the past, present, and future of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis nations, achievements, contributions, and cultures of their relationships with Canada. A little more critically than the Assembly of First Nations, we have the Indigenous Task Force, which are a subdivision of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada, which comprises of a cohort of Indigenous architects. And so they, in a direct response to the announcement of this gift, which up until this moment, none of the Indigenous organizations had any idea that this was being done to them. So for many, it was a big shock. And so the response was a lot more heated when it happened, because there was no consent of or knowledge of this happening. And so I'll blast through a few quotes, which you can see up here as well. But Indigenous peoples have always get me the hand-me-downs, the buildings and the lands that settlers no longer have any use for. So I found the use is a very important word within this dialogue. Canada's Indigenous communities have for too long been forced into leftover spaces that fail to connect to any meaningful way to their cultures and unique connectivity to place. On a positive note, the site is one of powerful significance and symbolic of a maturing nation-to-nation relationship built on mutual respect. However, there is also an equally significant discord between the building itself and the values of Canada's Indigenous communities. Classical revival is perhaps the architectural style most identified with colonization. This building, which references Washington architecture, has formal rooms, offices, and hierarchies echoing structures of European authority. It is not the first choice for Canada's first people, said the task force. However, suppose the federal government moves forward with this idea In that case, the task force says the site offers an opportunity to either build a new purposely built structure, which ultimately is what they would want, or to repurpose the existing building with vacant land on both sides, which has later been proved that there's very limited space for them to achieve this. David Garneau, an Indigenous author who talks a lot about Indigenous spaces, describes how Indigenous identities are shaped and influenced by their built and imaginary environments. So regardless of the decorations that Indigenous groups will be putting in here, or the language that they speak, or the people who will be occupying the building, the physical structure, if it remains as is, will still reference an inherently colonial style of architecture. And it'll continue to perpetuate a feeling of colonialism in these spaces. So this is where the nature of this building becomes a little bit tricky. So despite Justin Trudeau's efforts and intentions to have Indigenous peoples at the heart of the parliamentary precinct in an attempt to move towards a reconciliation nation-to-nation relationship, the fact is that this building is designated heritage poses numerous constraints to the types of interventions that can happen. And that is enough of that. So one of the Indigenous Task Force's architects, Douglas Cardinal, and for everyone who's familiar with Washington, but the Native American Museum was designed by him as well. And he also designed our Museum of Canadian History as well. So he has been working hand in hand with a former hereditary chief, William Commanda, from the Anishinaabe Nation of Akikodjiwan to come up with what he wanted to call the Circle of All Nations. So ultimately, it was the Algonquin's vision of what this place on 100 Wellington would be. But due to soil remediation project, access to this island is no longer accessible in the near future. And within the 50-year plan of the NCC, there's, which is the National Capital Commission, a federal organization that governs any historical site or monument within the national capital area. Within their 50-year plan, they haven't yet mentioned when this could happen. When news came out that there was a space given to Indigenous peoples at 100 Wellington, a lot of the initial reactions from the communities of Algonquin and Anishinaabeg nations felt like it would have been an either-or situation. And I just want to clarify that despite the narratives behind the plans for this space that are still very vague and ambiguous, and the murkiness of what may happen with 100 Wellington, ultimately the Algonquin and Anishinaabe still want to have both. This island will serve as a different purpose, less of a space to deal intergovernmentally with the federal government, but more of a place that will be strictly for Indigenous by Indigenous peoples. And so, to give a little bit of context, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was established in 2008 after a decade-long research by Indigenous scholars and professionals and other governmental allies in order to research the impacts, the social, political, economic, and cultural determinants that had drastically impacted multiple generations of Indigenous peoples, predominantly from the lens of the impacts of the residential schools and how it has impacted Indigenous peoples intergenerationally over several decades or several generations. And thus, in 2015, the TRC had concluded that the main objective of the settler state had been to eliminate Indigenous peoples. and their claims to land and their culture. And so Call to Action 79 in particular, subarticle 1, focuses on revising the policies, criteria, and practices of the national program of historical commemoration to integrate Indigenous history, heritage values, memory practice into Canada's national heritage and history. So when a project as controversial as 100 Wellington comes to light, I see potential for making reconciliation happen within this context, but there's still a lot of policies that need to be changed in order for this to happen. And so a member of Parliament had proposed this bill shortly after, which promises about $24 million over the 5 years to incorporate Indigenous values in our national parks and historic sites. Our House of Commons have passed the bill, but it has been sitting idle in our Senate for the past 6 years, so since 2018. So in addition to the National Program of Historical Commemoration, it has gone through some changes. However, the latest version has yet to be released, and so there is no way of knowing what this document will do to address Indigenous values, histories, and memory. And this is the ultimate determining factor, because this is the guideline that will dictate what this handbook sees Indigenous values being, and whether we can try to incorporate these in like a site like 100 Wellington. And so questions that I've had would be like, can we redefine what our heritage is? Especially in a space like this, does it have to stay stuck in stone since 1932 that a Beaux-Arts building has to always be a Beaux-Arts building? Can't we recognize Indigenous values and incorporate those now? And another big question is like, are existing sites or places commemorated under colonial notions of heritage protected from decolonization through repatriation? So this is more important because I will share some concluding thoughts at the end of the presentation. And so now the important part and the more interesting part, and I want to pay attention to these images here and maybe do a screenshot, but my presentation will be shared anyways. But I will click through as I talk to each point. So in response to this gift, the Assembly of First Nations, along with the other Indigenous organizations, tasked Indigenous architectural firms to come up with a design for their new building. So David Fortin, Wanda Della Costa, and Aledia Smoke were chosen, and they state that as Indigenous architects, we recognize the potential narrative of this historic site and its challenges. The vision of Indigenous values honors our elders and all the Algonquin people. We design by listening and working collaboratively towards an expression that celebrates Indigenous presence. This is our priority. So they further state that their team has Métis, Anishinaabe, Plains Cree, Inuit representatives with voices from youths to elders, and that their team deliberately is diverse and carefully structured for a collaborative design process. The process is just as necessary as the final project, is what they say. And this is how they build rich understanding of the place, embody Indigenous heritage, and welcome visitors from local community to abroad. And so I will share a list. And for those curious, they published, this is a collection of books, mostly Indigenous architects. I can share it afterwards. I think I use it in my slides as a reference as well, but I'll be quoting from this as well. So the nation-to-nation axis here. Remember that this is facing our Parliament Hill, our most prized institution in Canada. So the Algonquin Gathering Circle is directly opposite Parliament. So the sacred fire on the axis. So we have a sacred fire, centennial flame here, and they want to put a fire here as well. So the sacred fire on the axis with the centennial flame honors the nation-to-nation connection between Indigenous peoples and Canada. the land, our elders teach that we are close to Mother Earth. An Indigenous garden and celebration space invites visitors into a sacred space of year-round programmed activity. The wigwam inner structure at the east entry. So the birch bark wigwas panels of pre-contact Algonquin architecture inspire transparent glass panels to lightly envelope the Beaux-Arts facade of 100 Wellington, a European typology on unceded Algonquin land. The east entry honors a sunrise of new beginnings. The wigwam outer structure, which is what you see here, is in the Algonquin wigwam bentwood supports. A second layer holds the glass shingles against the inner structure, providing insulation for the heritage building. Under the theme honoring the gift, it is an honor to be gifted a blanket. In marriage ceremonies, this gesture represents the uniting of two unique individuals. We wrap the existing building together with the outdoor space, connecting our visitors in an embrace. And then the regalia. So we honor this gift by wrapping in regalia decorations reminiscent of snowshoes, so like you can see up here. All these snowshoes, feathers, jingles, drying frames, and gems. Each piece is designed by an Indigenous community so that our diverse people all are present. It changes over the years, resilient, beautiful, old gifts returned, new gifts applied, a unified but diversely inflective voice. And then diverse voices, so representing Inuit Métis Nation and First Nations, and more than 636 First Nations, my apologies. We feel at home and welcome here. A place that resonates with many voices. So end quote for that. So at the place of connection to the sky, a circular meeting space, which we see here, where that flame is. This space allows representatives to meet in a space honoring protocol such as pipe ceremonies. Views over Parliament connect to the outdoors with layers on the roof garden. So the outdoor roof garden, well, I was supposed to click here. And cafe look directly over Parliament at celebrations and events. At the same time, the building wraps extends gently above, providing privacy and a comfortable environment with shade and shelter. So though this is only just a written description, and obviously there are architectural renderings that show what it could potentially look like, we can see how much meaning has gone into its design and conception. So as you can see from these images in the description I just read, there is a deliberate consideration to envelope the heritage building to address the energy loss. This envelope also provides additional living space surrounding the building on the outside, which gives them more freedom of design compared to the inside of the building, which has constraints in terms of heritage designations on the inside. And so the more I read these passages over and over during my research, the more I began to see the subversiveness of the design intent. So the meanings behind all of the design elements are carefully chosen to honor and respect the gift provided by the government. It quickly became clear to me that by creating a narrative that reciprocates the intentions of the gift, by protecting the decrepit building with an envelope, the designers are subverting this gift to suit their needs. So for those familiar with any curatorial or museum studies and the history of Indigenous artifacts, it's the colonial state and its institutions that are those that dictate under which parameters these artifacts can be displayed and or protected. So by covering this building entirely with glass, the Indigenous peoples are now the ones protecting this artifact of a building from the elements that have been slowly deteriorating it. So as this space sits, as this space has yet to be completed within the vision of the Indigenous organizations, we can only speculate at this point. We already know that the physical characteristics of this building are directly associated with colonial institutions and will be difficult to navigate. It's unclear how much interventions can occur within a building like this, and there does not seem to be any indication as to if it can go anywhere and how far it can go. As it sits today, we can see that there are projections in the windows. So those are ways to adorn this building with Indigenous art, but whether it's permanent or temporary, it doesn't impact the building envelope itself. They've installed flags here to represent each Indigenous organization, and they've also built this wheelchair accessible ramp in the form of a wigwam, which you can see would have, it's a miniature version of what they would want to do to cover this entire building. They have hosted art galas on the inside as well, but based off of the details that I've heard, it's still just images on tripods in front of colonial architecture. In addition to all of this, the Algonquin Anishinaabeg Nation were fighting to have their stake in this project, especially that it's on their unceded territory that they've been fighting with the government for the past 4 decades to try to settle the land claim. And so within the political hot mess that has happened, mostly all behind doors, one of the solutions from the government was to gift them this building, which sits right behind 100 Wellington. And as you can see, it's a very similar building of that style, very colonial, and still protected federally. So there's just as little interventions that can happen here as well. And even fewer articles written about this building. Though during my research, I was able to find out that given all this context, that this bank was established in Ottawa predominantly during the logging boom, and they issued grants and loans for loggers, which inherently dispossessed a lot of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people from the Ottawa Valley area. So for them to be gifted a building that is directly linked to an institution and a place where people physically handed out money to settlers to then have them dispossessed is just like a bigger slap in the face than not being invited to participate in the 100 Wellington. And as mentioned here, anyone familiar with Ottawa, this is a former road that has limited access to vehicles, so it's predominantly a pedestrian walk. It spans maybe a kilometer or so, about a mile, maybe not quite a mile, but practically every single building along this walk is has heritage value to them, whether their full facades are or not. It's formed part of a cultural landscape while walking through here, so it just makes it even trickier to take a space like this. And we're quickly approaching the end here, I promise. So since submitting my research, the government of Canada have gone to tender for Block 2, which is the entire city block that wraps around this building. And so when this building, 100 Wellington, was gifted to the Indigenous organizations, essentially parceled it off, and now it just belongs to them. Despite it having all this red tape for heritage components, it's still the Indigenous groups that get to manage and run this building and whatever land that they can get around it, which is still to be determined. But the rest of the building that form in the shape of a C around this are also historic buildings, some more historic than others, but they desperately needed to be redeveloped because a lot of them had old energy systems and their building envelopes were just not efficient enough. So this is the winner. And as you can see, it's very different. But what's the most important part is that the government published this on their website, but didn't publish the drawings that I showed you previously. So they're actively showing all Canadian citizens that this is what this place is going to look like. But if anyone noticed before, I meant to write it, but there was a two-row wampum-built sidewalk to show the nation-to-nation relationship, arcing back to 1613, which had an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch. And here you can see there's like a nice green space, which is nice for anyone trying to bring in more trees into an urban environment, but it doesn't show the centennial flame or the fire that the Indigenous groups wanted to create. But the main drawback or drawaway from here is, or takeaway, is that they're just failing to recognize what the Indigenous groups want as a building. And so, in conclusion, the truth is that this building and most colonized spaces do have and will encounter similar experiences of multi-layered heritages in the same place at the same time. I firmly believe that this building will define how Canada will come to reconcile its relationship with heritage buildings and Indigenous peoples, if done right. So this case study can set a precedence for what heritage we want to create now to sustain our nation-to-nation relationship for the future. It also has the potential to fail Indigenous peoples entirely, once again by reverting to settler-colonial perceptions of which historical materiality is more critical. I see this overall trend, or this practice becoming trendy, as in May of 2022, the Hudson Bay Company donated their Winnipeg location to the Southern Chiefs of Manitoba. The building required between $50 and $100 million of renovations, but they opted to parcel it off and give it to an Indigenous group rather than put the money back into it. But they've taken it with optimism and will transform it into urban Indigenous housing, hopefully, if coding can change, and it will serve for either commercial businesses or a resource center for Indigenous peoples as well. And what I notice here is that it's what I suspect will happen is that if this catches on, is it's a way to maintain colonial infrastructure, but funneling Indigenous grants and resources through these like deceptive means. And it goes back to what the Indigenous Task Force says. They always get like the hand-me-downs, and they can never have like the land that they really want to fight for and develop their ideas the way that they want. So I feel like there's like two cases here where it'd be interesting to watch. Obviously, the example of the Hudson Bay Company is not a federal recognized building, so but doesn't mean that it won't have as much red tape to navigate. And so, concluding here, looking back at what Justin Trudeau has done in the name of reconciliation, such as the renaming of spaces, it's simply just a settler move of innocence, if we want to quote Tuck and Yang. So on the surface, they have done something tangible and of meaning, absolving them of any guilt and responsibility. Tuck and Yang have argued that for authentic reconciliatory results, there needs to be concrete, tangible action to support these promises of reconciliation, which can only happen through the actual physical decolonization of this building. So suppose the former US Embassy stands as is, and the Indigenous organizations do not get the space they want. In that case, this act of gifting is nothing more than just a metaphor for how Canada views its relationship with Indigenous peoples. And that is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christopher. Absolutely fascinating. I love listening to you present and bringing all this knowledge out west here. Most of our registered viewers are from out west, so it was really wonderful to hear you bring that knowledge. Thank you so much. We
Thank
have
you.
I would encourage anyone to put questions into the Q&A, especially students from Dr. Miller's class. But to start off, Christopher, I'm actually going to just throw one out to you because I'm familiar with the area. I went to Carleton for my master's, and so I lived there for a few years in Ottawa. And I know Spark Street, and I'm just wondering, given the location of 100 Wellington, facing the Parliament and having Spark Street behind it, it's really sort of an area of congregation of tourists and community. Like it's an area that is known. So I'm wondering to what extent the community is actually aware of this proposal. And is it shown at all? Is there anything that surrounds maybe the building that you can see that there's a discussion, ongoing discussion about this?
Yeah, no, that's very interesting that you asked because as mentioned, it's something that hasn't really been published on the government's websites, whereas they're going ahead showing the redevelopment of the adjacent buildings around it. And so there's no billboard or anything like that showing what the vision is as of yet. I think maybe because of all that political infighting since 2017, and it's only been recently and maybe the last year that the Algonquins have accepted to take that space. Essentially, no other conversations can go forward with what they want to do with that. So it's possible that that design is not set in stone and can change, but it's what has been working with now. And other than like the heritage community, which is kind of has its mixed feelings, it's still for the most part, they still see it as an important building and we can't touch it. And there's like no sensitivity to the Indigenous cause or context. But outside of that, I would say the general public really doesn't know much. They probably know that it belongs to the various Indigenous organizations based off of the flags and the displays in the windows. But other than that, nothing else.
Thank you. We have a question that just came in from our class. And it says, could you speak to some of the barriers in developing the proposed vision of David, Wanda, and Eladia? And is it even possible now with the proposed block development?
So if we were to assume that both projects can go ahead at the same time, then yeah, there would have to be a lot of negotiating and navigating, especially with the space that is on Spark Street, because it's essentially sandwiched between two other buildings that will have to be redeveloped by the contractor that has those buildings within its space. But in terms of the any vacant lots that are on each side of 100 Wellington, I know that the Algonquin and the Indigenous groups are going to fight for those spaces. And so it'll be interesting to see how those get parceled off. But I know that the design that Wanda Fortin and what's the last name? My apologies. Their proposal, it's still a very massive achievement and endeavor to take, because it's going to take up so much space, and I think they want to do that on purpose because they despite this building still being massive on its own, I think they want to really put their mark there. They want to not be blended into the background, and if they're going to be a prominent voice within the parliamentary precinct, then it's going to be through that practice. But there's too many balls up in the air in terms of the red tape for heritage buildings, and I really hope that there's gonna be a precedence for loopholes where they can actually not touch it, but just wrap it in glass and say, hey, we didn't touch it. But I know that the cultural landscape weight of the argument for its heritage value might be in question, but it's nice to see the contemporary approach from the other buildings around. It might take a lot less. It might lessen the weight of that argument. So it'll be interesting to follow that in the coming years as it develops. But it's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one that was submitted with a registration from a community member, and they are looking for some guidance or just information on if one wants to gift real estate holdings to an Indigenous nation or Indigenous nations, what are the steps to take?
Are we talking within the US or in Canada?
It's not specified, so maybe if you
Okay.
have a comparison that you can provide.
Um, so I'm not quite sure. I want to say that it might be slightly easier in the States, but both Canada and the US have different approaches to managing lands and how they are parceled off, either providing land transfers to Indigenous peoples or their nations. I know in Canada it's very difficult, especially when it comes to usually it's people who own private land, and you can have private land that could be adjacent to federal land. And within the context of Canada, private land is governed by provinces. Um, and but I think there's an example of how it happened, but there's of a lot of boxes that need to be checked in order for that to happen. I think, um, but it is a good question. I can always share. There's like a CBC podcast episode that of Unreserved that addresses this particular issue. So I think it'd be a 40-minute lesson, but it provide a better answer than I can do in 2 minutes.
But that's perfect because it kind of aligns well, transitions well into this one question that we have from a community member as well. They're looking for information on good places for news coverage of this building or any academic publications currently available or upcoming. So how can people find out more or follow the discussion?
I honestly have been setting up Google alerts with the address or the name Indigenous Peoples Space. So not much has really happened, but hopefully more will. And so throughout my research, it got very few pings, but it would be maybe the space is open for a open doors day, or there might be an event where they're going to feature um, an art display for a specific yearly event. But other than that, unfortunately, not much has been said or published lately about that in the news. In terms of other like papers or articles, I don't know if anyone else is going to, but essentially, a I will attempt to write up an article for this, and hopefully it'll be published by the end of this year through Bridgewater University. And so, yeah, I can potentially write up 3 different approaches to this building. So, if not, I can always share a link to my master's research through Carleton University as well. If anyone's interested as well, I can share that with you.
We have time just for one last quick question, and it's from our class. We had a couple other questions come in, but we won't have time to address those. So from our Indigenous placemaking class, the students are asking if you think the use of historic preservation laws could increase as a means to limit meaningful Indigenous placemaking.
That's hard to tell because of that national program that I was referring to. Um, Ideally, if it wants to, like the Parks Canada, which is the governing body that um, manages at least heritage within the context of buildings or historic sites and monuments and things like that. They've already acknowledged the call to action and want to do good by incorporating it, but there hasn't been any indication as to like where that can go. So it could all just be a line that says, well, we're going to recognize Indigenous values, but showing you that there's the Métis National Council, the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, which also have various Inuit communities that have some distinguished cultural practices amongst themselves. And then you have 634 distinct First Nations that have different values. Some of them are very universal, more or less, but a lot of them are very specific. And so is this document going to start incorporating like what it considers an Indigenous value, or is it going to have like all of the Cree values and all the Algonquin values and all of the like Inuit values? And so I'm hoping that instead of just taking in an existing colonial document with colonial heritage values, they're gonna and then incorporate Indigenous values, whatever those might look like. I'm hoping they're gonna try to decolonize some of the notions that they have of existing heritage values and kind of maybe be a little more introspective on that sense. And that's what I would like to see, because if it's just a status quo, but add a sprinkle of Indigenous content, it's not the way that decolonizing spaces work. It's like you don't add Indigenous and then hope for the best, because no one's happy with the result at the end of the day. So hopefully that answered your question, but if not, feel free to shoot me your question by email, and it probably won't be answered today, but I can slowly chip away at them. And yeah, I'm here to share.
That's a great way to wrap up, Christopher. Thank you so much. It was highly enjoyable and a great learning experience. And so I'd also like to thank again our sponsors here at Western Washington University, the Center for Canadian American Studies, the Ray Wolpo Institute, and Fairhaven College of Interdisciplinary Studies. And everyone who chose to support our center and our speaker series talk. Really, it does mean a lot to us to be able to continue our programming and open up a space for emerging scholars. I appreciate this opportunity, and all of you will receive a recording of this webinar that will be emailed out to you from the Foundation for Western and Alumni within the next few days. And our next speaker is going to be in April. So we've got a little bit of time until the next wave of invitations will be sent out. So once again, thank you so much, Christopher, and to everyone who joined us. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Have a great day.
Great. Thanks. Bye, everyone. It was a pleasure.
Bye.